It is nearly 20 years since the end of the 1992-1995 Bosnian War, a conflict whose far-reaching impact continues to influence policymakers today. The massive intentional destruction of cultural and religious property during the war, targeting Bosnia-Herzegovina's historically diverse identity, was one of its defining features and prompted an urgent reassessment of how cultural property could be protected in times of conflict. Later prosecutions against those held responsible for the attacks led to a more definitive recognition in international humanitarian law. The destruction of a people's cultural heritage was not only a crime in itself, but also a manifestation of persecution and genocide, especially in the trials carried out at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Initiated by Bosnian Serbs, separatist Bosnian Serbs, aided by Serbia, following Bosnia's declaration of independence from Yugoslavia, the conflict pitted separatist Bosnian Serb and later Bosnian Croat forces against the internationally recognized government of Bosnia-Herzegovina, labeled by many commentators and politicians as Muslim, as in the Muslim army or the Muslim-led government, which did not help when trying to get aid going to Bosnia. Yet the Bosnian War was not considered a religious one, although those promoting the conflict certainly mobilized the past and ethno-national and ethno-religious differences. Above all, it was characterized by the practice of ethnic cleansing to create ethnically homogeneous areas. So here's Arkan's tigers in Bijeljina in 1992 and in a mosque. The ethnic cleansing was characterized above all by the expulsion of targeted groups, internment in concentration camps, mass murder, torture, mass rape, and the destruction of the religious and cultural symbols of the expelled population. Also notorious were the long siege of Sarajevo by Bosnian Serb forces, during which the National Library was targeted, and the extensive devastation of Mostar. This is the interior of the library. And the extensive devastation of Mostar, particularly during fighting between Bosnian Croat and Bosnian government troops over 1993, when the Ottoman Old Bridge was destroyed. During 3.5 years of war, over 2 million people, almost half the country's population, were displaced or became refugees. Nearly 100,000 people were killed, and thousands of monuments of cultural and religious importance were destroyed or badly damaged. Yet throughout the conflict, there was a large United Nations multinational peacekeeping force and international humanitarian aid presence in Bosnia. That's the center of Sarajevo, and that's the National Museum. There were two openly voiced aims in this destruction of cultural and religious property. First, to obliterate and remove from the landscape the material evidence of the expelled community's historic roots on the territory. And second, by destroying these symbols of community identity, to discourage the expelled populations from ever returning. Thus, the destruction was identified quite unmistakably by perpetrators and international observers alike as being an intrinsic part of the process of ethnic cleansing. By the end of the war, for instance, with one exception, not a single intact minaret was left standing in areas occupied by Bosnian Serb forces, who controlled 70% of the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And here's the imam of the mosque after the war, showing a picture of the mosque before the war and its remains in 2000. Before and after. This is the Serbian Orthodox Cathedral, top right and after. The defining characteristics of the attack on cultural and religious property is that they were intentional and systematic, that the greater part of the destruction occurred as a result of deliberate targeting, and the most occurred far from the front lines or after fighting had ceased in areas where insecure control of the perpetrators. The types of built heritage destroyed or badly damaged were overwhelmingly religious and overwhelmingly Ottoman or associated with Muslims, though there was also destruction and damage to the Catholic Croat or Orthodox Serb heritage. Also targeted were structures with no ethno-national affiliation, but which symbolized or held evidence of Bosnia's historic diversity, such as museums, archives, libraries, and institutions, like the Oriental Institute in Sarajevo. Thus, the destruction can be seen as an assault on the physical evidence of a historic coexistence and heterogeneity. In Bosnian Serb-controlled Banja Luka, where there were no military operations at any time, 15 mosques, 12 of which were listed monuments, were destroyed. And this was the Ferhadia before its destruction, after its destruction. Then the site was leveled and the remains taken to the municipal garbage dump. This is the retrieving of the remains at Ramici in 2005, and how the site looked in 2005 before restoration or reconstruction began. This is the Allergy Mosque in Faccia before, and this is a satellite picture which was used at the War Crimes Tribunal. In October 91 on the right, you can still see the minaret. On August 92 this is of the Allergy on the right, you can see there's just an empty space. And that was the site of the mosque in 1996. This was a Catholic church which suffered the same fate. And this was the fate of most of these sites, mostly of mosques. They became places where cars were parked, garbage were dumped, sometimes structures were built on them. This is just after the ethnic cleansing of Faccia, this mosque in the background, the Zarava. These were the remains in 2000 where I found them. And occasionally, mosque rubble was used to cover the mass graves of Muslims. And here is at Faccia, on war crimes investigators were excavating a mass grave site and found remains of the Allergy Mosque. But what actions did the international community take in confronting and addressing the devastation of cultural property in Bosnia? It was very clear that international legal instruments for protecting cultural heritage in times of conflict just didn't work, and there were UN troops stationed across the country, but they still couldn't stop it happening. But in other respects, unfortunately, despite a flood of statements, resolutions, and appeals, some policy making, and an eruption of symposia on disaster preparedness, most international heritage bodies, including UNESCO, ICOMOS, and ICOM, seemed unable or unwilling to offer help where help was needed and being desperately begged for in Bosnia itself, in terms of perhaps technical assistance, emergency aid, and even for information. The Director General of UNESCO encouraged NGOs to step in where he alleged UNESCO was not able to operate, but this simply didn't happen. And the tiny organization I worked for, BHHR, was the only heritage NGO working in Bosnia throughout the entire conflict. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe was the only international organization to take any form of action in respect of the heritage, sending consultant experts to assess the destruction in 10 information reports that they hope would galvanize the international community, international conservation community, into taking action to protect the heritage that remained and political action to stop the damage happening of what they called, the report called, a cultural catastrophe in the heart of Europe. Unfortunately, these hopes were largely unrealized. The reports, however, raised early on what was rarely achieved, and probably not even today, the need to integrate support for the cultural heritage into other humanitarian aid activities and the importance of giving emergency technical assistance before the conflict ended. They urged international actors to beware of behind false reasons for not intervening at an early stage, nor to feel ashamed of being concerned for the cultural heritage while people were suffering, pointing out the socioeconomic and psychological dimensions of the destruction. So here we clearly see the paradox of cultural property protection in times of conflict. Even though international humanitarian law clearly mandates protection of a people's cultural property, concerns over being seen to be privileging buildings over people remain problematic for international bodies, even those concerned with heritage protection. Thus, there was very little assistance to protect Bosnia's cultural heritage during the war, with a few notable exceptions, such as Italian aid to restore domed mosques in Mostar. Yet much could have been done, for example, to help museums and their workers to protect their collections, most of which survived the destruction. Small-scale efforts usually work better than large ones, and with ingenuity and persistence, supplies got through, even if some were lost, and vital links were maintained with the outside world. After the signing of the Dayton Agreement in December 1995, this marked the end of the war and Bosnia's division into two entities, the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina the so-called Muslim Croat Federation, and the Serb-dominated Republika Srpska, with an international appointed civilian high representative, one of whom we have here today, Wolfgang Petric, who with a NATO-led multinational military force was responsible for implementing the peace treaty, which focused above all on the effects, reversing the effects of ethnic cleansing. Uniquely, Dayton recognized the role cultural heritage destruction had played during the conflict, and among the treaty's 11 annexes, Annex 8 mandated the establishment of a commission to preserve national monuments, which former High Representative Wolfgang Petric will discuss later on in more detail. Thus, restoration and preservation of Bosnia's destroyed and damaged historic monuments should have taken place within a particular framework: the return of refugees and displaced people under the terms of the Dayton Agreement to the homes and communities from which they had been forcibly expelled, and to attempt to restore Bosnia-Herzegovina's diverse pre-war society. And have I got time? I just wanted to finish, what I didn't think I'd have time to say was that a huge proportion of the aid for restoration in Bosnia went to Mostar, which was badly damaged and was terrible, but it sucked up most of the available funding. This is the reconstructed old bridge. And it became a kind of, obsession of the bridge as a symbol, the bridge as a symbol of reconciliation. Mind you, whereas in Republika Srpska, the Serb-dominated part of Bosnia, where there were returning refugees, this is where most restoration actually was going on. And it was almost entirely community-based, and it never got any assistance from the international community at all, because they were basically afraid to operate in Republika Srpska. So here's some men. Here's Zvornik restoring the turbe of a sheikh. This was funded by community who were based all over the world, but they would send donations to rebuild the mosque. This is the Avdic Mosque near Plana. This little mosque, Mesjid, was rebuilt, even though no Muslims returned to this area of Republika Srpska, but many wanted to be buried there, as you can see in the graveyard, and they also wanted to show that Muslims had lived on this territory. So even though none had gone back there, they still rebuilt this little Mesjid, mosque without a minaret. I think this is in Stolac. And I just want to finish with this example of how aid from the international community could have been given. Now, this is the Faccia, the Mehmed Pasha Kukovica Mosque, one of the domed mosques in Bosnia, now in Republika Srpska, Bosnian Serb-dominated territory. It was surrounded, you can see, by many historic buildings. There's the Han over on the left. But it was almost destroyed during the war. This is in 2000. Now, this was the sole domed mosque structure left in the territory of Republika Srpska. In 2000, after the war, when there was a huge international presence in Bosnia, it could have been given emergency protection. The Republika Srpska heritage people would not have been interested or wouldn't have been permitted to do anything here. The Bosnian one was not allowed to, which had been the State Institute for Protection of Monuments before the war, wasn't allowed to operate in Republika Srpska. So nothing was done. In 2004, there was a storm and the dome collapsed. So by 2008, when the Commission to Preserve National Monuments formed under the Dayton Agreement was allowed to operate there, and they received funding from the US Ambassador's Fund for Culture, they gave the now very long overdue emergency protection to this structure. So for a bit of basic protection in 2000, 5 years after the end of the war, this structure would still be there. Now it's just basically a wall. Thank you.